I was hunched over a stack of paperwork, pretending the numbers mattered more than the quiet hum of the shop around me, when she sat down. Right next to me. No warning, no polite pause. Just the soft scrape of her chair against the concrete floor, and suddenly the air was smaller, tighter, like it was holding its breath. "Stop pretending you're busy," she said. Casual, but there was a tilt to her voice that made it impossible to ignore. Not mocking. Not teasing, exactly. More like, she knew something I was trying not to admit, something I didn't even fully admit to myself. I blinked at her, trying to hide how ridiculous I felt. She leaned back just enough to let one arm drape over the back of the chair, crossing her legs slowly, deliberately. Her eyes, dark, deliberate, scanned the forms I had stacked in front of me like they were invisible, but still somehow she saw every tremor in my hands. I looked down, counted the edge of a page, and tried to focus. The shop smelled faintly of motor oil and old paper, a mix that should have been grounding but wasn't. It was the kind of smell you only notice when someone is near, when every other noise or scent fades into something meaningless. She hummed under her breath at something on my page, a small sound that shouldn't have mattered, but it did. My chest felt tight. My fingers stopped moving for a second longer than they should have. I noticed the way her hand lingered near a stack of forms, not touching them, just hovering, like she was considering something, weighing it. She didn't have to say anything. There was a quiet confidence in the way she existed in that small corner of the shop. Someone who didn't need permission, but also wasn't threatening. Just compelling. I wanted to look at her again, but my head stayed bent over the papers, though I felt her gaze resting there. It was that impossible mix of warmth and scrutiny, like she could see through the act I'd been perfecting for weeks. The "I'm focused, I'm responsible, I'm fine" act. And yet, she didn't call me out directly. She just sat there. Then, almost by accident, our hands brushed. A tiny thing. She was reaching for a pen I'd absent-mindedly left on the corner of my desk, and our fingers touched. Not a handshake, not a grab. Just a flicker of contact that set something running under my skin, something I hadn't expected. I jerked my hand back slightly, but she didn't. She looked at me, a brief pause in her expression, almost curious, almost amused. "I swear, you're impossible," she murmured, more to herself than to me, but the sound wrapped around my nerves like smoke. And in that instant, it wasn't the paperwork or the hours left in the day, or even the hum of the fluorescent lights above. It was her. Her presence, her quiet command of a space I'd always thought I owned for focus and solitude. I tried to concentrate again, tried to make the numbers matter, tried to convince myself I wasn't thinking about the way she leaned back, the way she looked at me like she was waiting for me to fail and somehow hoping I wouldn't. But my brain had already stopped listening. Later, when she finally left, I didn't notice the papers I'd been working on were all misaligned, some half-finished. I didn't notice the clock ticking overhead. All I noticed was the faint echo of her voice, the ghost of her hand brushing mine, and the impossible feeling that I'd just stepped into a room I wasn't ready for, and that I didn't want to leave. And I couldn't stop thinking about that small, almost careless flicker of contact, the one that told me nothing and everything. I didn't mean to linger, but somehow I ended up following her through the narrow aisles of the repair shop, holding a tray of tools she said she needed. She walked ahead with that easy confidence, but I caught the slight stiffness in her shoulders, the way her heels clicked a little harder against the concrete than necessary. "You always insist on helping," she said over her shoulder, not exactly a question. Her tone was calm, but there was a trace of something behind it, something I couldn't name. I tried to hide my smile. The workbench was cluttered with parts, some new, some battered beyond recognition. She set down a cylinder with a quiet sigh that almost went unnoticed, except I noticed. Her hands lingered on the edge of the bench. I saw the faint tremor in her fingers as she wiped a smudge off the metal. For a moment, I wondered if she always carried her life so carefully, measured and deliberate, like every movement mattered. I placed the tools beside her. "Here," I said softly. Don't strain yourself." My voice caught in a way I didn't expect. She glanced at me, one eyebrow raised, and there was a flash, an almost imperceptible vulnerability, before her mask slid back into place. "I'm fine," she said. Short, clipped. But I caught the quiet exhale she tried to swallow, the way her lips pressed together for half a second longer than necessary. I worked beside her, letting my hands move over metal and grease, pretending I was absorbed in the task. But I kept noticing little things. The delicate curve of her fingers as she twisted a bolt, the faint laugh she let slip when a screw rolled off the table, the shadow under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights or too many long days. There was a pause in the work. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. She leaned slightly over the bench, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and the smell of her coffee, faint perfume, something warm and unplaceable, hit me in a way that made my chest tighten. She didn't look at me, and I didn't want her to. But I wanted to see her, every flicker of fatigue and every flicker of life in her expression. "You don't have to do everything yourself," I said, softly this time, careful, as if saying it too loud might break the fragile thread of honesty I glimpsed in her. She gave me a glance, quick, sharp, and then looked away. For a moment, her shoulders sagged ever so slightly, and I thought I saw the tiniest crack in her armor. Just a flicker, gone before I could point it out or even name it. And then she laughed, a little too loud, brushing past me, and it was almost like she was daring me not to notice the weight behind it. My fingers itched, wanting to reach out, to do something small, meaningless, just to bridge the space between us. But I didn't. I just watched, quietly, taking in every detail, every careful movement. When she finally turned back, her eyes met mine for a heartbeat longer than necessary. It wasn't confession. It wasn't invitation. But it was enough. Enough to make my chest ache and my mind replay it over and over. The soft, charged hesitation of someone who both needed and feared being seen. The storm hit just as we were closing up the shop, rain hammering against the corrugated roof in uneven bursts. I was wiping down the counters when she appeared beside me, holding a mug that smelled faintly of something sweet, vanilla or caramel. I couldn't tell. She didn't say anything. She just leaned against the edge of the counter, close enough that the heat from her body brushed mine. "I didn't think you'd stay late," I said, fumbling with a rag, trying not to look at her too long. She shrugged, but her fingers lingered on the rim of the mug, and I noticed the fine lines at her knuckles, the faint tremor as she adjusted her grip. "I work better at night," she said quietly. "Less noise, less expectation." We stood like that for a long minute. Rain pattered, lights flickered overhead. I wanted to say something, anything, but my words felt clumsy, inadequate. There was a secret we both knew but hadn't spoken aloud, hovering in the humid air, the awareness of proximity, the weight of a boundary we hadn't crossed yet. I moved to clear some tools, but she stepped closer as I reached for a wrench. My hand brushed hers. Not intentional, not fleeting, just close enough. I felt it, the shock of her presence against my skin, the way her warmth lingered even as I tried to focus on the metal in front of me. "You always do that," she murmured, almost to herself, the words sliding out between the roar of the rain. "Pretend like you're untouchable." I froze. The words weren't accusatory, but they landed in the middle of my chest like a stone. I wanted to respond, to say she was untouchable too, in some sense, but I couldn't. Not yet. Then my phone buzzed in my pocket. I glanced down, a name I didn't recognize. She noticed the shift, her eyes flicking up at mine, just long enough for a hint of worry, or was it calculation, to pass across her face. External pressure. A reminder that the real world, with rules and obligations, was still there, demanding attention. I shoved the phone back into my pocket. "Probably just a wrong number," I said, keeping my voice steady, though I felt my pulse spike. She gave a small, tight-lipped smile, and for a moment, I thought we might lean closer, share something unspoken, admit it with proximity rather than words. But the moment fractured, lightning struck outside, a deafening crack, and she stepped back instinctively, as though the storm itself had imposed boundaries we hadn't dared cross. I caught her hand for an instant as she turned to grab a towel, barely touching, barely brushing, but enough to make me dizzy. Her fingers lingered an imperceptible second longer than necessary before she moved away. My chest tightened, my mind spinning with what could have happened in that heartbeat. She left the towel on the counter, her eyes flickering to mine again. Searching, testing, maybe daring. And then she turned fully, giving me space that felt painfully empty. The storm outside continued its rhythm, and I stayed frozen, hand resting where hers had been, replaying the near action over and over. I wanted to reach for her again. I wanted to speak the words that trembled behind my teeth. But instead, I stood still, the silence between us heavy, electric, and impossibly charged. I found her in the corner of the shop the next morning, leaning against the open garage door. The rain from last night had left the concrete damp, and the air smelled like wet metal and faint coffee. I hadn't meant to watch her, not really, but there she was, calm on the surface, shoulders taut underneath. "Are you okay?" I asked, trying for casual. My voice came out smaller than I wanted. She didn't answer right away. She just looked at me, eyes steady, unreadable. Then she shook her head lightly, almost imperceptibly. "I don't know," she admitted finally, voice low. Almost a whisper, like it was dangerous to say aloud. That stopped me. It was the first time she'd let anything slip, anything unguarded. I swallowed and leaned against the counter, hands in my pockets. "I mean, me too, I guess." My words sounded hollow, even to me. She laughed then, but it was brittle, more like a cracked hinge than amusement. "You say that like it explains anything." "No," I said, shaking my head. "It doesn't. I trailed off. I didn't know how to articulate the pull, the tension, the way proximity had rewritten the rules between us without permission." She tilted her head, watching me. "What are we doing?" she asked suddenly, her voice sharper now, tremulous underneath. The question wasn't about romance. Not yet, but about the strange, inexplicable energy that had built between us. The unsaid, the unclaimed, the too close too fast reality. I looked away, because any answer I gave would betray more than I intended. I tried to focus on a streak in the concrete, a fleck of rust, anything other than the heat in her gaze. But the silence stretched, heavy and awkward, and in that pause I realized neither of us could pretend this was normal anymore. She shifted slightly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. The gesture was mundane, but everything about her in that moment, the tired curve of her shoulders, the faint tension in her jaw, made my chest ache. She wasn't asking for answers. She was just offering the truth of herself, and it terrified me to see it. "I don't want to ruin anything," she said quietly, "but I can't keep pretending, either." I swallowed. I could feel her words like pressure building in my chest. "I neither," I admitted. Her eyes softened slightly, and for a fraction of a second, I thought she might reach for my hand, or say something that would make this real, tangible. But she didn't. She just stood there, waiting, breathing, as if willing the storm inside both of us to quiet itself, even for a moment. Finally, she stepped back, and the distance between us felt enormous. The light from outside slanted across her face, highlighting the tiny shadows under her eyes, the faint lines of care and worry. "I don't even know if I want this," she whispered, almost to herself. And just like that, the words hung in the air, raw, honest, and devastating. I was organizing the shelf of manuals when she appeared, carrying a small stack of papers. Her hands trembled just enough for me to notice, but she didn't say anything, only set them down carefully in front of me. I glanced at the top sheet and froze. It wasn't a work order or a repair form. It was a photograph, folded at the corners, worn like it had been carried for years. She crouched beside me, keeping her distance but close enough that I could see the subtle pull of tension in her shoulders. I found it," she said, voice low. "I meant to throw it out, but..." She trailed off, eyes fixed somewhere beyond me, somewhere I couldn't reach. The photo was of a man, older than me, hands calloused, smile wide, and something in her gaze, soft, almost reverent, made my chest tighten. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Her silence said everything. He was my first real mistake," she said finally, almost like a confession she wasn't sure she deserved to make. Her fingers brushed the edge of the photo, hesitated, and then retracted, as if afraid of touching memory itself. I kept my distance, letting her have the space to share, though every instinct in me wanted to reach across the small expanse of the bench. I didn't know, I whispered. I try not to think about it, she said, shaking her head. But some things, they follow you. Some people stay with you, even when you don't want them to. Her eyes flicked to mine for just a moment, and I thought I saw a spark of recognition, or maybe warning. I swallowed, heart thrumming in a rhythm I couldn't ignore. You're not that person, I said softly. Not a defense, not a promise. Just a statement I needed her to hear. She let out a laugh, quiet, humorless, almost sad. I know, but it doesn't erase anything. You don't just forget the ones you've let slip through your fingers. She paused, tracing the outline of the photo with a fingertip. He died before I could say anything. I didn't get to tell him I loved him, not properly. The words sank into me like stones. I didn't reach for her, though I wanted to. I just felt the floor shift beneath everything I thought I knew about her, about us, about how slowly boundaries and walls could be built and shattered at the same time. I looked down at the photo again. The man's eyes were alive with something she couldn't retrieve, and yet I could see why she carried it, why she hesitated, why a single photo could weigh more than years of words. She folded it carefully back into its envelope and placed it on the shelf, avoiding my gaze. And then she turned to leave, shoulders tense, as if every step forward was measured against the past she couldn't leave behind. I stayed where I was, heart hammering, chest tight, watching her disappear into the workshop light. And yet, even as the space between us filled with silence, I couldn't stop thinking about the way she'd looked at that photograph. Not with anger, not with longing exactly, but with something far heavier, regret and the faint, impossible weight of love lost. And for the first time, I realized the depth of her walls, and that I didn't want to push them down. I just wanted to stand close enough to feel their tremor. The shop smelled faintly of rain and oil, the leftover scent of storms and work, and somehow it felt like the only place in the world that made sense at that moment. She was sitting on the edge of the workbench, legs swinging slightly, hands resting on her knees. I stood nearby, pretending to organize a pile of wrenches, but I wasn't really seeing them. I was seeing her. You don't have to explain everything, I said quietly, more to myself than to her. The words came out slower than intended, fragile. She didn't answer right away. She tilted her head, studying me, and for the first time I noticed how small the faint lines around her eyes softened when she was tired but unguarded, how the corners of her mouth carried a shadow of a smile she didn't try to hide. I know, she said finally. Voice low, steady, but not entirely calm. And I don't want to. We fell into that kind of silence that isn't awkward but heavy with possibility, a shared rhythm neither of us forced. I didn't step closer, and she didn't pull away. It was enough to just exist near each other, breathing the same damp, warm air. I realized, with a small, unsettling thrill, that this quiet understanding, was what we had been building toward all along. Her fingers brushed against the edge of the bench, almost reaching mine, and I stayed still, heart thumping in a way that wasn't fear, not exactly. Anticipation, maybe, or recognition. I let my hand hover near hers. A breath later, our fingers touched lightly, a ghost of a connection that didn't need words. Funny, she murmured, voice barely above the hum of the shop. How close you can be to someone without saying anything. Yeah, I said, and it was the truest thing I could think to say. No promises, no confessions, just acknowledgement. She shifted slightly, moving a little closer on the bench, and I noticed the faint scent she carried, the lingering warmth of coffee, and something unnameable, comforting, like it belonged. My fingers grazed hers again, tentative, deliberate this time, and she didn't pull away. Instead, she let her hand rest near mine, near enough that our knuckles touched lightly, almost as if we'd always known this moment was coming. I looked at her, and she looked at me, not with expectation, not with demand, not even with longing exactly, but with recognition, mutual, quiet, earned. The air between us felt different now, charged but safe, intimate without needing to be defined. We stayed like that for a long minute, listening to the quiet creaks of the shop, the distant drip of rain from the roof, the subtle rhythm of each other breathing. Nothing dramatic, nothing declared, but the weight of everything unspoken settled between us, heavier and lighter at once. Finally, she leaned back slightly, letting the bench take her weight, and I stayed standing nearby, letting the silence stretch, letting it be enough. Fingers still touching lightly, we didn't speak. We didn't need to. It was done. Quiet, unshakable, inevitable. And I realized then that sometimes the strongest bonds don't need words. They just need space to exist, a gentle acknowledgement, and a touch that says everything without saying anything at all. I remember walking out of that shop that night, rain still dripping from the eaves, and realizing how much had changed, not in some dramatic, movie scene way, but quietly, almost imperceptibly, inside both of us. The air between us had shifted, charged but steady, the kind of tension that wasn't about desire alone. It was understanding, patience, and the kind of attention you give when you see someone fully, flaws and all. I think about her sometimes, the way she moves through a room, confident but carrying the weight of things she never talks about. I've learned to notice the subtle things, the small sigh when she thinks no one is listening, the soft smile when she finally lets herself laugh, the slight tremor in her hand that hints at past heartbreak. And I realize that noticing her isn't intrusive. It's learning, slowly, how someone becomes part of your life without you planning it. For me, I changed too. I learned restraint, how to hold back when every instinct tells you to lean closer. I learned the power of quiet presence, of just being there, letting someone reveal themselves on their own terms. I learned that love isn't always fireworks and declarations. Sometimes it's sitting together in silence, fingers brushing, hearts acknowledging each other without words. We never labeled what we had. There was no sudden confession, no grand gesture. Just that gentle understanding, that mutual acknowledgement of something real, fragile, and earned. The kind of connection that doesn't demand anything from you, except honesty and attention. It's funny, in retrospect, how small moments carried the weight of everything. A hand brushing mine over a workbench, a laugh that hid exhaustion, a photograph that carried years of memory. Those moments taught me to see her fully and to see myself differently, too. I learned that intimacy isn't about perfection. It's about noticing, responding, and being willing to exist in someone else's gravity without trying to control it. She taught me patience. I taught her trust, though indirectly, without ever intending to. And in the spaces between words, between tasks, between shared silences, we built something that could have crumbled under expectation, but instead settled into something steady, warm, quiet. Sometimes I think about that first day, how she said, "Stop pretending you're busy," and I realized that was the beginning of everything. The spark wasn't romance yet, but it was attention, recognition, curiosity, and it was enough to carry us through months of subtle revelation, hesitation, and slow understanding. I don't know what the future holds for us. Maybe we'll never call it love aloud. Maybe we'll just keep showing up for each other in these small, quiet ways. And maybe that's better. Maybe that's exactly what we were looking for. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?